The sky was dark and heavy with smoke and strange lights filled the air with a red glow that made everything look like it was burning, and people walked in long lines, with their heads down and no one spoke a word, and there was only the sound of boots and machines and loudspeakers calling names. Lena stood in the line with her hands tied in front of her, and her eyes wide and scared, and her heart beating like a drum, and she did not know where she was going or why the men had taken her from the shelter and told her she was chosen, and that it was a good thing. She had thought it was a home, a real family, maybe someone who wanted her, but when she saw the huge black ship and the cages inside and the alien faces looking through the bars, she knew something was wrong, and she knew she had not been adopted. She had been sold. The ship took her and the others far away from Earth, and they were not allowed to speak or ask questions, and they were kept in small rooms with cold walls and no windows, and only strange food and loud noises that made her feel dizzy and sick. When the doors opened again, Lena saw a giant hall filled with lights and a tall stage in the center, and rows of chairs where many aliens sat with shiny clothes and glowing eyes and strange voices, and some of them looked like machines and some like animals and some like shadows. She was pushed onto the stage by a guard with metal arms and a voice like a drill, and he told her to stand straight and not move, and then a voice from the speaker said her number and her age and called her healthy and obedient and perfect for light labor or companionship. Lena did not know what to do. She looked at the crowd and felt like she was not real, like she was in a dream or maybe a nightmare. And then the bidding started, and the voices grew louder and faster, and strange numbers appeared on a screen behind her, and the price kept going up. Some of the aliens looked excited, some looked bored, and some just watched without blinking, and Lena kept thinking, this is not real. This is not real. But her legs were shaking, and her mouth was dry, and she wanted to cry, but no tears came. The highest bid came from a tall creature with no mouth and 6 red eyes and sharp hands, and the guard started to move her off the stage, and Lena felt cold inside, like her soul was gone. But then something happened, something no one expected. A voice from the back of the room said a number that was higher than all the others, and everyone turned to look, and the screen flashed, and the auctioneer paused and looked confused, but then nodded and said, sold, and Lena was pulled back. She looked at the man who had spoken, and he was not an alien, he was a human. Maybe 30 or 40 years old, with messy hair, and a long coat and tired eyes, and a strange tool in his hand, and he looked at her like she was not a thing. He said nothing as the guard handed her over, and she waited for him to hit her or chain her or tell her to kneel, but he just turned and walked away, and she followed because she had no choice, but something in her heart said this is different. They left the hall and walked through narrow metal tunnels and climbed into a small old ship with patches and wires and blinking lights, and Lena sat in the corner and watched him work, and he didn't even look at her. After some time he gave her a blanket and a bottle of water and said, you are safe now, and Lena stared at him with wide eyes and said, why did you buy me? And he looked at her and said, I didn't buy you, I saved you. She didn't believe him at first, because no one had ever saved her before, and no one ever said she was safe, and she didn't know what that word meant anymore, but something in his voice made her want to believe. The ship started to move, and the stars outside the window looked like rivers of fire, and Lena held the blanket tight and looked at the man and asked, what is your name? And he said, Kai. And then asked her name, and she said, Lena. He nodded and said, we're going far from here. And she said, where? And he said, somewhere they won't find you. And then he looked at her and said, you're not a thing, you're a person, remember that. Lena did not answer, but her heart felt warm and scared at the same time. And she looked out the window and saw nothing but stars and darkness, and she thought maybe this time the story will be different. The ship moved quietly through the dark sky, and Lena sat in a corner with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes fixed on the floor and her hands still shaking from what had happened, and she kept thinking about the red lights, the alien faces, the cold voices, the way they looked at her like she was nothing more than a thing to own and use. Kai stood near the control panel, pressing buttons and turning knobs and checking screens with quiet focus, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft clicking of metal as the ship flew away from the auction place and into unknown space. Lena watched him from the corner with fear and confusion, because he had not spoken since telling her she was safe, and he had not asked her to work or clean or kneel, and he had not locked her up or shouted or even looked at her like the others had done. She did not understand why he had saved her or what he wanted, and in her mind she kept thinking, maybe this is a trick, maybe he wants something worse, maybe I should run, but there was nowhere to go, and her body was tired and her heart was sore. After a long time, Kai finally turned and walked toward her with slow, careful steps, like he did not want to scare her, and in his hands he held a small metal box and a cloth, and he did not want to scare her, and in his hands he held a small metal box and a cloth, a small metal box and a cloth, and he knelt down beside her and spoke in a quiet voice that felt soft like music in a storm. He said, "You have a tracker in your neck and it is glowing, and that means they can follow us if we do not remove it, and I know someone who can help, but it will take time, and we need to stay hidden until then, and I need you to trust me just a little." Lena looked at him with wide eyes and said, "I do not want it there," and he nodded and said, "I know, and I'm sorry they did that to you, and I promise I will not hurt you. I just want you to be free." He opened the box and took out a small scanner and waved it over her neck, and a light blinked and a sharp sound rang in the air, and Lena flinched and pulled back, but he did not touch her and did not force her, and only said, "It is okay, you are okay. I am only scanning." The scanner showed strange symbols, and Kai frowned and said, "This is not a normal tracker. This is high-level military tech, and I do not know how it got into a girl like you." And Lena said, "I do not know either. I was just in the shelter, and then they came." Kai looked at her for a long moment, and then stood up and said, "You can rest now. I will not ask anything from you. I will not treat you like them. I know what it means to be used, and I will never do that to you." He walked away, and Lena sat alone with a storm of thoughts and questions in her mind, and she wanted to believe him, but belief was hard, and trust was something she had buried long ago with her name and her hope and her childhood. Later that night, or maybe it was still day, she could not tell in the deep space, Kai gave her some food, and it was warm and simple, and he said, "You do not have to talk, just eat and stay strong, and we will get through this." Lena took the food and ate slowly, and watched him fix a broken wire near the back wall, and she noticed his hands were rough and marked with burns and cuts and grease, and she thought maybe he was a worker like her, maybe he had been through pain too. She asked him, "Why did you save me?" And he paused for a second, and then said, "Because someone once saved me when I was small and scared, and I never forgot what it meant, and I could not walk away from you, not when I saw your eyes on that stage." Lena looked down and said, "I thought I was going to die." And he said, "Maybe you did, maybe the old life ended, but now a new one begins, and it will not be easy, but it can be better, and no one will own you again." She did not speak after that, and he did not ask her to. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the air around her was not heavy, and the walls were not closing in, and the silence did not hurt. She slept on a soft blanket near the wall and dreamed of stars and voices and someone calling her name, not with anger but with care. And when she woke up, the ship was still moving, and Kai was still there, and nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Girl who had stood on the auction stage was still inside her, but now there was something more, something small and quiet and glowing in the dark like a tiny seed of hope waiting to grow. She did not know what would happen next, but for now she was not alone, and that was enough. The ship moved through black space like a silent bird with broken wings, and inside the small room, Lena stood in front of a mirror staring at her reflection with eyes that no longer looked like a child and fingers that trembled as they reached for the side of her neck where something glowed beneath the skin. She touched it gently and felt a warmth, like a whisper, like a secret, and when she pressed it, the light pulsed and a strange sound echoed inside her head like wind mixed with words. Too far to understand, Kai stood in the doorway with a wrench in one hand and worry in his eyes, and he said, You should not press it again. We do not know what it does. And Lena said, I hear something like voices or maybe memories, and they are not. Mine. Kai walked closer and said, the tracker in you is not just for tracking. I think it is a control device or maybe a key to something, and I have never seen anything like it, and that scares me more than I can say. Lena looked at him and asked, what did they put inside me and why? And he shook his head and said, I do not know yet, but I will find out, and until then we stay low and keep moving. They reached a small moon covered in metal and smoke, and they landed near a hidden base where lights flickered and shadows moved, and the people there spoke in low voices and watched every corner like danger could rise at any time inside. The base was a woman with silver gloves and eyes that glowed blue, and she was called Dr. Vel, and she had once worked for the alien lords but had escaped after learning what they did to children. Like Lena, she looked at the scanner data and said, this is not just a tracker, it is a prototype implant for neural access. They use it to link human minds into their system for testing and control, and Lena is not the first, but she might be the last. Lena sat on the cold metal table and asked, can you take it out? And Vel looked at Kai and then at Lena and said, I can try, but it will hurt, and there is a chance you may lose parts of yourself like memory or feeling or something else we cannot predict. Kai said, we wait if it is too dangerous, and Vel said, the longer it stays the more it grows into her brain and the more she hears them, and if it activates fully they can find her in seconds, and not even space will hide her. Lena closed her eyes and said, do it now, and I will not scream, and I want it gone more than I want anything else. And Kai held her hand while the doctor prepared her tools, and the room filled with soft lights and deep humming sounds. The machine touched her neck and heat rushed through her veins, and she saw flashes of places she had never been, and people she had never met, and stars collapsing, and voices calling her name in strange languages, and all of it felt real and alive and terrifying. Her body shook and the metal table rattled, and Kai shouted her name, but she could not answer because her mouth would not move, and her eyes rolled back, and inside her mind something opened like a door that had always been locked. She saw a room with glass walls and children floating in tanks and alien scientists watching, and a voice saying, activate subject 9, and she knew it was her. She was subject 9, and they had made her into something else, something they wanted to control. Then the light inside her neck burst, and the machine sparked, and the doctor jumped back, and alarms rang through the base, and Lena screamed not from pain but from the sound inside her head growing louder like thunder and waves crashing over each other. The implant was still there, but it had changed. It no longer glowed, it shimmered like liquid, and Kai looked at the doctor and asked what happened, and she said, I think it woke up and it knows she is not under control anymore, and that makes her a threat. Lena opened her eyes, and they were brighter than before, like stars trapped in water, and she whispered, I felt them all. I heard their minds, and they are scared of me, and they should be. Kai helped her sit up and said, you are not a weapon, you are a person, and we will not let them use you. And Lena said, I am tired of running, and maybe it is time they start running from me. Base went quiet again, and outside the stars watched in silence as the girl who had been sold stood taller than before with something new inside her. Not fear, not rage, but power and something even stronger. She did not know what she was now, but she knew who she was, and that was enough to begin the next step. Asterisk. Lights in the base flickered like dying stars, and the air grew heavy as if something unseen was breathing through the walls, and Lena sat in the corner with her knees to her chest and her hands gripping her arms as the sound inside her head grew louder with each passing minute. Kai stood near the door talking to Dr. Vel with quiet words that Lena could not hear because the voices inside her mind were speaking again, not with words, but with feelings and flashes of images that made her heart race and her skin grow cold. She saw fire falling from the sky and buildings melting like wax and ships shaped like knives cutting through clouds, and children with marks like hers lined up in rows with empty eyes and slow steps, and the voice said, we gave you purpose and you were made to obey. Lena screamed without sound, and Kai rushed to her side and held her. shoulders and told her to breathe and focus on his voice, and not the ones in her head, and he said, "You are not theirs, you are your own, and no voice can take that from you." She looked into his eyes and saw the fear behind his calm, and she knew he was trying to protect her even if he did not know how, and she whispered, "They are inside me, and they are looking through me, and they are angry because I broke the link." Dr. Vell scanned her again, and her hands were shaking, and she said, "The implant is evolving, and it is no longer just a signal, it is now a bridge, and they are trying to use Lena as a door to reach into this world, and they are close." Kai said, "We have to leave," but Vell said, "It will not matter because they can track her through the voice itself now, not through the device." And Lena said, "I need to learn how to close the door before they open it." From their side, that night, if it was even night in a place where time had no sky, Lena stood alone in a chamber filled with wires and old machines and broken lights, and she closed her eyes and let the voices come, and she said, "I am not afraid of you anymore." The voices laughed not with joy, but with hunger, and they showed her images of what she could become if she let go, if she gave in and followed the code in her blood and the signal in her mind. And they said, "We can make you more than human, and more than machine, and more than pain." She clenched her fists and shouted, "I do not want to be more. I just want to be free." And the sound cracked the walls, and the lights exploded, and the air turned hot as if a sun had blinked awake inside her chest, and then everything went quiet. Kai ran in with fear on his face and saw her standing in the center with fire in her eyes and light on her skin, and he whispered, "Lena," and she turned to him and smiled a little and said, "I found the lock, and I found the key, and they cannot enter now, not unless I let them." Silence that followed felt like peace, but it was not peace, it was only the calm between storms, and Kai knew that, and Lena knew it too, and Dr. Vell said, "They will not stop, because you are the first to survive the activation, and they will come for you with more than voices." Lena walked to the window and looked at the stars that no longer looked silent, and she said, "Then we do not wait for them, and we do not run, we go to the heart of the storm, and we finish what they started, before they finish what they planned." Kai asked her, "Are you sure?" And she said, "I am not sure of anything, except that I cannot live like prey, and I will not be a ghost in someone else's system, and if I have to burn to stay human, then I will burn." They prepared the ship in silence and packed only what was needed and left behind the base with no goodbye and no promise to return, and the stars opened before them like a path made of memory and pain and hope. Lena sat in the pilot chair and placed her hand on the console, and the ship answered her touch with a soft hum as if it recognized the change in her, and Kai looked at her and said, "You are not the girl I found on that stage." And she said, "No, I am not, but I am still Lena." As they flew through the endless dark, she closed her eyes and listened not to the voices that wanted to control her, but to the quiet sound of her own breath and the steady beat of her heart, and the memory of someone once saying, "You are safe now." The dark did not speak again that night, and Lena knew it would return, but now she had her own voice, and it was louder than fear. The stars ahead looked like open eyes watching every move, and Lena sat in the ship with her fingers resting on the panel, and her thoughts moving faster than light, and each breath felt heavier as the questions inside her grew louder with no answers. Coming from the silence around her, Kai stood near the wall reading old data files stolen from the last base, and his brow was tight with worry as the same name kept appearing again and again in every hidden report, every broken log, every encrypted message. And that name was not a place or a person, but a project called Echo Seed. Lena heard the name, and something in her body reacted, not in fear but in memory, like a sound from childhood or a word she had never spoken but always known, and she asked, "What is it?" And Kai looked at her with a voice too low to be calm and said, "It is what they made you for." He handed her a cracked tablet with a flickering screen, and she saw the truth in pieces and fragments and secret files written by people who did not see her as a girl but as a subject, as an object, as a design. And the word Echo kept repeating with numbers and warnings and final notes saying, "Unstable potential, high, contain or erase, She wanted to throw the tablet, but her hands would not move because the weight of what she saw was not something she could drop, and the name Subject 9 appeared again and again, and the face shown in one of the test images was her younger self, eyes empty, mouth silent, and wires attached to her head. Kai said they wanted to make a living signal, not just a transmitter, but a conscious network node, something that could speak and think and control systems without machines, something human that could touch every corner of their empire from inside. And they chose children because young minds adapt faster and break slower. Lena whispered, "Why me?" And Kai said, "Maybe because you survived what others could not, or maybe because they saw something you never saw in yourself." And Lena said, "They used me like I was not real, like I was a tool." And Kai said, "Then let us make sure you are never used again." Ship moved toward a planet hidden in old star maps, a place erased from trade routes and guarded by broken satellites that floated like silent bones in space. And on that planet was the lab where Project Echo Seed began and possibly ended. Lena knew the answers waited there, and maybe the ones who made her were still alive, or maybe something worse waited, but she did not turn away and did not slow down because running had never made the voices stop, and now she wanted them to hear her coming. They landed in the ruins of a compound buried under ash and time, and the buildings were cracked and black, and the air smelled of burned wires and old blood. And Kai held his tool gun and checked every corner while Lena walked forward without blinking, as if the place remembered her. Inside the main chamber they found a core room still powered by a deep generator, and on the walls were symbols drawn in circles and patterns made of light, and the center had a chair shaped for a child with cuffs and cables, and a voice spoke from the wall saying, "Welcome, Subject 9." Kai raised his weapon, but the voice said, "No threat detected." Neural pattern confirmed, access granted, and Lena said, "I am not your subject, I am not your voice, and I am not your tool." Walls responded by opening a file showing a countdown, a schedule, and a plan for global activation, and Kai read the words with a face full of dread and said they planned to link every Echo child to a central mind and overwrite their thoughts and use them to control entire populations without a single soldier. Lena stepped into the chair, and the system asked for a final command, and she closed her eyes and spoke one word, "Freedom." And the chair sparked, and the wall shook, and the signal burst out into the stars. Not a call to war, but a pulse of light that carried her will, her choice, her defiance across distant planets. Other Echo children woke up with wide eyes and clear thoughts, and the voice that had always whispered in their minds went quiet for the first time, and they cried or laughed or just breathed, because they were finally alone in their own heads. Lena stepped down from the chair, and Kai caught her as her knees bent, and she whispered, "I felt them all waking up like candles in the dark, and none of them are sleeping anymore, and none of them will ever be silenced again." Kai said, "They will come for us now." And Lena said, "Then we show them what real voices sound like outside the ruins." The sky cracked with thunder, not from weather, but from ships breaking through orbit, and alarms rang through the dust, but Lena stood tall and calm with fire in her eyes, not from power, but from purpose. She was not a weapon, and not a number, and not a plan. She was a person who had taken back what they tried to steal, and now she was ready to speak louder than ever before. The sky above the ruins turned red as enemy ships broke through the clouds with roaring engines and beams of light sweeping across the broken land, and Lena stood on the cracked stone with her feet steady, and her eyes locked on the sky, and her voice calm as she said, "They found us." Guy pulled her back behind a wall and opened his worn bag full of scrap parts and defense tools and said, "We knew they would come, and we are not going to run." And Lena looked at him with something fierce in her face and said, "I was never going to run." The air shook as the first blast hit the ground near them, and dust rose like smoke from an old fire, and Lena heard the voices again, but this time they were not whispers, they were warnings. They were echoes of others who had woken up across the stars, and some were calling her name. She focused on the sound, not to follow it, but to guide it, and for the first time she realized She could send something back and not just receive, and she thought of the others like her still hiding still. Scared, still chained in silence, and she spoke through the link with a voice that said, "We are not weapons. We are not ghosts. We are not yours." Far away on distant moons and silent labs, the Echo children heard her and stood up and broke their chains and shattered the monitors that watched them, and they walked away from the labs without looking back, and some began to run, and some began to fight. Kai set up a pulse bomb near the gate and said, "This will slow them down," and Lena said, "I can slow them more," and she walked into the open space between the ruins and raised her hands and closed her eyes, and the ground answered her like it had been waiting. Machines buried under years of ash stirred awake, and lights blinked in patterns that matched her heartbeat, and old systems once built to control her now followed her will, and the enemy ships paused as their own systems flickered with errors and confusion. One ship fell from the sky with a silent crash as its engine turned against itself, and Kai stared at her with awe and said, "You are learning fast." And she said, "I have to, because time is burning and fire is coming." They moved deeper into the ruins where other survivors had gathered, and some were children, some were old, some were wounded, and all of them looked at Lena like she was not a child but something larger, like hope wrapped in skin and flame. A little boy with dirt on his face held her hand and said, "Are they going to hurt us?" And she knelt beside him and said, "Not while I am breathing." And the boy nodded and held tighter, and in that moment, Lena felt more human than she had ever felt before. She stood again and faced the center of the old lab and said, "If they want to burn this place, then let them see what fire really looks like." And Kai said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "I am going to use the signal one last time, but not to speak, not to listen. I am going to overload it and erase the link forever." Kai said, "You might not survive." And she said, "I might not, but if I do nothing, then others will not survive either, and I cannot carry that weight. I cannot sit still and let silence return." She walked to the core with wires snaking like veins and machines humming like a heartbeat, and she placed her hands on the frame, and the light around her grew so bright that shadows vanished and voices screamed from far away, begging her to stop, to wait, to listen. But Lena did not stop and did not wait and did not listen, because she had found her own voice. And it was stronger than any command and louder than any code, and the machines obeyed her because they remembered her pain. The signal burst like a star dying, and the waves it sent out touched every node, every lab, every dark corner where an Echo child had once been held, and the connection snapped and broke and fell apart like old chains turning to dust. Lena fell to her knees with her heart racing and her breath shallow and her skin burning with light, and Kai ran to her side and held her as her eyes fluttered, and she whispered, "They cannot use us anymore, and they cannot touch us, and they cannot follow us." The sky outside turned quiet as the remaining enemy ships lost their power and drifted like broken wings, and the survivors looked up and saw nothing chasing them, and for the first time in years they felt safe. Lena opened her eyes and saw the stars above her, and felt the hand of the little boy still holding hers, and she smiled, not because it was over, but because something new had begun. She stood with help and looked at Kai and said, "We did not run, we walked into the fire, and we are still here." Kai said, "You are more than they ever dreamed." And Lena said, "I am not what they made, I am what I chose." The wind moved across the empty fields of the ruined planet, and the sky above was clear for the first time in years, and Lena stood at the edge of the hill with dust on her boots and light still glowing faintly under her skin, and her eyes fixed on the stars that once hunted her. Behind her, the others were rebuilding walls and sharing food and singing songs that had no words, and Kai sat near the fire with a boy on his lap and tools spread around him, and his face softer than it had ever. Then Lena walked slowly through the camp as people smiled at her and touched her shoulder and whispered thanks, and for each voice she heard a story, and each story was filled with pain and courage and something stronger than fear, and she felt part of them in a way she never had before. There were no chains left, and no walls around their minds, and the link that once connected them to their captors had become something else, something pure, something human, and though they could still feel each other across the stars, it was no longer control, it was connection. She sat with Kai that night as the fire cracked, and the boy beside them played with wires and metal, and she asked, "Do you think they will come back?" And he said, "Maybe they will, maybe in a different form, maybe in a different voice. But now we know how to stand." Lena looked at her hands and said, "I still feel it sometimes, the pull, the code trying to wake up." And Kai said, "That code is not who you are. It is what they tried to make you, and you broke it, and no one can take that from you." She nodded and said, "I used to think I was a tool, that something inside me was not mine but theirs, and that I was only worth what I could do for someone else, but now I know I was never theirs. And I never will be, and I do not belong to any system or lab or leader." He said, "You belong where you are safe and wanted and loved." And Lena looked at the people around her and felt the truth in his words like a warm blanket on a cold night, and she said, "Then I belong here." Morning came with laughter and work, and children running between tents, and Kai teaching them how to build things with scrap, and the sky watching in silence, as something new began, not with fire, not with war, but with choice. Lena stood beside a wall they were fixing and helped a girl tie wires, and when the girl asked her how to make the lights blink, she smiled and showed her and said, "You just need to listen to the wire like you would to a person, and it will tell you what it needs." The girl laughed and said, "You talk like a machine." And Lena laughed too and said, "Maybe because I used to be more machine than person, but now I am learning how to be something else." And the girl said, "You are already something else. You are brave." Later that day a message came through a small radio someone had fixed, and the voice on the other side said, "We heard your signal, we saw what you did, and we want to help, and we want to join, and we want to be free too." Lena took the radio and said, "Then come here and find us and bring nothing but hope, and we will share what we have and build what we need, and no one will own us ever again." And the voice on the other end cried and said, "Thank you." That night they lit fires across the hills, and each fire was a promise and a memory and a warning. And as the stars turned above, then they danced and sang, and remembered the ones who did not make it, and honored the ones who did. Lena stood with Kai as the music faded, and the children slept, and the world felt quiet again, and she said, "I was sold like an object, and bought like a tool, and trained like a program. But someone saw me and said, 'You are not for sale.'" Kai said, "You were never a thing, you were always someone. You were just waiting for someone to say it." And Lena said then, "I will say it now and forever, to every child, to every voice that feels lost, and to every heart that feels owned." She took a piece of metal and carved words into a wall, and the words said, "No one belongs to anyone, and every voice is its own, and every child is family, and no family is for sale." When she finished, she stood back and looked at it and smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. And as the stars watched her from above and the fires warmed the earth below, she knew that she was not alone and never would be again. She was free, and she was home.